I never planned for that road trip to mean anything more than time on the highway and space for my thoughts. When my brother told me he couldn't go at the last minute and asked if his best friend could take me instead, I said yes without thinking. It felt easier than admitting I was nervous. Lucas had always been kind to me, too kind sometimes. He was the kind of person who filled a room just by standing in it, confident, warm, the kind of man people trusted without asking why. And he was engaged. More than that, he was my brother's friend. That should have made everything simple. It didn't. The drive started quietly, the kind of silence that sits heavy instead of peaceful. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the sun low and pale against the windshield. Lucas played soft music and kept one hand steady on the wheel. I watched the lines on the road blur past, trying not to think about how close our elbows were. Every time the car shifted, our arms brushed, and I felt like a spark I wasn't supposed to notice. He talked about ordinary things, work, the heat, traffic, but there was something careful in his voice, like he was choosing his words one by one. By the time we stopped for gas, the sky had darkened into early evening. The air smelled like asphalt and warm wind. I stood beside the car while he filled the tank, and for a moment neither of us spoke. It was strange how quiet the world felt in that empty stretch of highway. He asked me how I was really doing, not the polite version people usually wanted. The question surprised me. I shrugged and said I was fine, but he didn't look convinced. He never pushed. He just nodded as if he understood more than I said. We reached the motel late. The neon sign flickered like it hadn't fully decided to stay awake. The parking lot was nearly empty. At the front desk, the clerk apologized. Only one room left, 2 beds, no other options of miles. I glanced at Lucas, ready to suggest sleeping in the car if needed, but he shook his head gently. "It's fine," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes flicked away for just a second. That tiny hesitation stayed with me. The room smelled faintly of detergent and old air. 2 narrow beds stood on opposite sides, a small table between them. I tossed my bag onto one and sat down, suddenly aware how loud my own breathing sounded. Lucas moved slowly, like he was afraid to disturb something fragile. We talked about nothing important, how early we should leave, the weather for tomorrow, whether the coffee would be terrible, the kind of talk people use to avoid what they don't know how to say. When the lights went off, the room didn't feel dark enough. The glow from the parking lot slipped through the curtains in thin lines. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, counting the faint buzz of the old air conditioner. After a while, Lucas spoke softly from across the room. He said he sometimes wondered if life moved too fast, if people made big decisions before they truly understood themselves. His voice sounded different in the darkness, less certain than it had all day. I didn't know why he was telling me this, but I listened. I told him I felt like I was always waiting for what I wasn't sure. The word surprised even me. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It felt full, like something unspoken was resting between us. At one point, I turned slightly on the bed, and I could sense him doing the same. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. I imagined reaching out, not to touch him, just to make sure he was real in the dark. The thought alone made my chest tighten. I stayed where I was. The next morning came with pale sunlight and the hum of distant trucks. We acted normal, too normal. Jokes returned, and everything looked the same on the surface. But something had shifted underneath. At a roadside diner, he watched me over his coffee with a softness I hadn't seen before. I looked away quickly, pretending to study the menu, afraid of what I might find in his eyes if I met them too long. On the road again, the miles passed faster. We shared stories, laughed, even sang badly to the radio. Yet every light moment carried a shadow. I kept reminding myself of who he was and who I was supposed to be to him. Friend, passenger, nothing more. Still, when our hands brushed as he passed me a bottle of water, neither of us pulled away right away. It lasted only a second, but it felt longer. By the time the sun began to dip again, the tension was so quiet it ached. I didn't know what I wanted to happen, only that I was afraid of what might if we kept going like this. That night, as we parked outside another motel, Lucas sat in the driver's seat with the engine off hands resting on the wheel. Without looking at me, he said softly, "This trip, it feels different." I didn't answer. I didn't trust my voice. The next morning began with an uneasiness I couldn't shake. It sat in my chest like a quiet warning. Lucas acted normal again, too normal, talking about maps, routes, breakfast stops. I nodded, answered when expected, but my thoughts kept returning to his words from the night before. This trip feels different. I wondered if he regretted saying it. I wondered if he meant it the way I did. We stopped at a small diner just outside a desert town. The booths were worn smooth from years of travelers passing through. Sunlight streamed in through dusty windows. As we waited for our food, Lucas scrolled through his phone. A smile crossed his face, quick and familiar. I didn't ask, but I knew. Ava. The reminder pressed against my chest harder than before. The life he was building waited for him at home. And here I was, sharing pieces of him that didn't belong to me. After breakfast, we drove deeper into open country. The land flattened into wide silence, skies stretching endlessly in every direction. There was something about wide spaces that made people honest. Lucas told me about his fears, how everyone expected him to be certain, steady, always sure of his next step. He admitted he sometimes felt like he was playing a role he had agreed to without reading all the lines. I listened without interrupting. I didn't try to fix anything. I just let him speak. I could feel the boundary between us thinning with every mile. When we pulled over at a scenic lookout, the wind was strong enough to steal our voices. We leaned against a railing side by side, watching clouds drag slow shadows across the ground below. I realized then that I had begun to measure time by moment with him. Gas stops, songs, passing towns. Each one quietly precious. That scared me more than I wanted to admit. Emotional attachment was easier to hide than physical closeness, but it cut deeper. Later, a sudden storm rolled in without warning. The sky darkened fast, rain slashing against the windshield in heavy sheets. Lucas steered us off the road beneath a small roadside shelter, barely more than a roof on metal beams. We stood there in the wind and rain, soaked from knees down, laughing at the ridiculousness of it. Then the laughter faded. We were too close again, breathing the same damp air, sharing the same narrow space. For one suspended moment, the world felt small enough to disappear. Lucas lifted his hand, not to touch me, not quite, but close enough that I felt the heat of it in the air. His eyes searched mine, uncertain, questioning. My heart hammered, so loudly I was sure he could hear it over the rain. Then something passed across his face. Guilt, fear, responsibility. He lowered his hand. The space between us returned, heavier than before. We didn't speak much after the storm passed. The road felt narrower now, the silence sharper. That evening, he drove longer than planned, as if distance itself might put something back in its place. When we finally stopped the night, the motel lights buzzed in the dark like tired insects. Inside the room, we moved carefully again, bags set down, shoes lined neatly by the wall. 2 beds, same invisible line between them. He sat on the edge of his bed with his elbows on his knees. I could see the struggle in his posture even before he spoke. "I shouldn't lean on you the way I have," he said quietly. "That's not fair to you." The words landed heavier than anything he could have confessed. I wanted to tell him that leaning on me was already too late to take back. Instead, I told him I understood. We both knew that wasn't the full truth. Later, as the room darkened, my phone buzzed softly. A message from my brother asking how the trip was going. I typed back a simple reply, "Good. On the road. No lies. No truth either." From across the room, I heard Lucas's phone vibrate a few seconds later. He didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was warm, familiar, filled with a tenderness meant for someone else. I turned onto my side, facing the wall, trying not to feel how deeply that sound cut. Sleep came late and light. Somewhere in the middle of the night, thunder rolled distantly. I thought of the storm from earlier and how narrowly we had turned back. The closeness still hovered between us like unfinished words. I knew then that what was happening didn't need touch to be real. We were already giving each other things we weren't supposed to. In the early morning, Before either of us fully woke, I heard Lucas whisper my name so softly, I wasn't sure if he meant to. I stayed still. A moment passed. Then he spoke again, barely louder than breath. "If things were different," he said, and stopped. I waited, heart pounding. His voice shook when he finished. "I think I'd already be in love with you." The word stayed with me long after the room fell silent again. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Some truths are too heavy to lift once they're set down between two people. When morning came, the sky was pale and quiet, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Lucas moved around the room like nothing had happened, careful, distant in a new way. I followed his lead. We packed in silence, checked out without conversation, and returned to the car like two strangers who happened to be traveling the same road. The final stretch of the trip felt longer than all the miles before it. The laughter was gone now. Even the music felt wrong, so Lucas turned it off. The only sounds were the engine and the wind slipping past the windows. I watched towns pass without really seeing them. Part of me wanted to rewind time to that first quiet night when everything was still uncertain. Another part of me wanted to jump ahead to the moment when this ache would finally loosen its grip. Near the edge of the city, Lucas finally spoke. "When we get back," he said slowly, "everything changes again." I knew what he meant. Ryan, Ava, responsibilities that had waited patiently while we were on the road. I nodded without trusting myself to speak. The truth was, I didn't want things to go back to how they were. But wanting didn't give me the right to keep what I had borrowed from his life. When we pulled into the driveway, Ryan was already outside. He greeted us with a grin and pulled Lucas into a quick, familiar hug before turning to me. "You survived the trip?" he joked. I smiled and said yes. The lie wasn't in the words. It was in everything I didn't say. Ava called later that evening, her voice cheerful and excited on speakerphone as she talked about wedding plans and how much she missed Lucas. He answered her with a kindness that was real. Watching him like that was the hardest part. It reminded me that he was exactly who he had always been. It was only my place in his world that had changed. We didn't see each other for a while after that. Life moved forward in its careful, ordinary way. I returned to my routines. Lucas returned to his. Sometimes I caught his name in conversation, or saw a photo online of him, and Ava smiling at some event. Each time, a strange mix of pride and sadness tugged at me. I wanted him to be happy. I just wished the part of him I'd met on the road didn't have to fade so quietly. Weeks later, I ran into him by accident at a grocery store. The encounter was brief and awkward at first. Two people unsure of how much of the past they were allowed to acknowledge. We spoke about small things. Weather, work, nothing important. Then, just as we were about to part, he looked at me with the same steady seriousness I'd seen on that last night of the trip. "I think about you more than I should," he admitted softly. There was no promise in his voice, only honesty. I told him I thought about him too. That was all we needed to say. Time passed. The wedding date drew closer. I kept my distance, not out of bitterness, but out of respect. On the day Ryan told me the engagement was official, I congratulated him with a calm smile. Later that night, my phone vibrated with a message from a number I knew by heart. It was from Lucas. There were no long explanations, no declarations, just a few simple words. "You mattered. You still do." I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Then I typed back, "So do you?" The wedding came and went. I didn't attend. I was afraid of what it might stir up in me, afraid of the part of myself that still remembered the quiet darkness of motel rooms and the sound of rain on metal roofs. Instead, I went for a long walk alone, letting the air cool my thoughts. I realized then that what we had shared wasn't something that needed to be erased to make room for his future. It could exist as it was, a chapter that shaped us both without defining the rest of our lives. Months later, on another ordinary evening, I received one final message from him. There was no regret in it, no longing that asked for more than memory. That road trip, it said, showed me who I was when no one was watching. I'm grateful for that. I held the phone in my hands for a long time before replying. "So am I." We never crossed a physical line. We never ran away. We never became the story the world might have judged us for. But what happened between us was real all the same. It changed how I understood closeness, how I understood longing, and how I understood letting go. Some connections aren't meant to last forever. Some are meant to arrive quietly, leave without explanation, and stay only in the place where memory and feeling overlap. And in that space, he will always be with me. Not as the person I couldn't have, but as the one who taught me that even the love we don't choose can still shape who we become.